Hi everybody, and welcome to this policy masterclass on marine monitoring. We are just going to wait a couple of minutes for everyone else to arrive, if that's okay. Cheers. So if you hold on, that'd be great. Thank you. Hi to everyone who's just arriving. We should have about 30 people, so we're going to wait a couple of minutes just to make sure that we've got everyone. Thank you. We'll wait. Yeah, I'll give it till 2 minutes past, 2 or 3 minutes past, and then we'll start. Thank you for bearing with us. Okay, I think we'll get cracking. We've got a bit of an introduction bit before Hayley gets into it. Thank you all for coming to the latest in the series of the ECOWInd Policy Masterclass series. Today we're going to talk about marine monitoring, and we are very fortunate to have with us Hayley Hinchin. Hayley is a principal consultant from Howell Marine Consulting. She's ex-DEFRA and then ex-JNCC, and she spent a lot of her career trying to unlock the puzzle of getting effective marine monitoring done, and has been doing work for DEFRA over the last 9 months looking at a review of the UK marine monitoring system. So she's going to talk us through some of that today. Before we get into that, Hayley, could you go to the next slide? We're always plugging the next webinars that we're doing. We are on marine monitoring today on the 12th of June. The next masterclass series is going to be an overview of a 5 capitals approach to marine management. So this is some work that we originally did for the Marine Management Organisation last year, and is looking at how do we bring in not just natural capital, but the other capital, so social capital, financial capital, human capital, and others into decision making, and what are the evidence requirements for that? So that should be fascinating. But without further ado, next slide, Hayley. So Hayley is going to talk us through marine monitoring, what we understand by that in a sort of policy delivery context, and how the evidence and research community can contribute to it. And then, as always, at the end, we're going to have a panel discussion, and we're really fortunate, as well as Hayley, to have Paul and Henk on that panel. Paul joined us 6 months ago at HMC from CFAS, where he did lots of work on monitoring. And Henk, many of you will know as running our offshore wind research programs, but in a previous life, he also worked at JNCC and was quite instrumental in some of the monitoring programs there. So we should hopefully have a good discussion at the end. As always, if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A, and we'll take them at the end. I've got some pre-prepared questions for the panel, but it's always good to get your contributions as well, so we can make sure this is as useful for you as possible. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to Hayley for the main presentation. Cheers, Hayley.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dickon. Slides all good? Moving along okay? Yeah, fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be able to talk to you a little bit about marine monitoring today. I'll jump straight in because I've got 20 minutes, and the topic of marine monitoring is quite a wide-ranging one, with many organisations, activities, programmes, purposes, monitoring designs, and data collection methods currently kind of underway and in operation across the UK, or contributing to our marine monitoring capability. In terms of what we mean by marine monitoring, on the face of it might seem kind of quite self-explanatory, but there are several different kind of interpretations of what monitoring is, a couple of which you can see, key ones you can see here. And whilst I don't think it's super useful to get sort of too stuck in the semantics at this point, it's probably just worth clarifying at the outset that essentially we think of marine monitoring activities as providing the long-term contextual background element of the evidence base that informs sustainable management of the UK's marine environment. And it's also worth probably saying that increasingly we're thinking of marine monitoring not just in terms of taking repeat measurements of the environment, but also of how people interact with it and benefit from it. And there are a range of sort of legislative obligations and drivers for marine monitoring, but it can often be more useful to think about how monitoring data can inform operational management decisions and processes at different nested scales. So as we move from large scale status assessments and processes at the top of the funnel here, into more regional planning processes and decisions, and then down to smaller scale site management or project level consenting decisions, we often find that we need finer resolution data and higher confidence in how different parts of the ecosystem and society will be affected by a particular decision. And this nested system of processes and requirements for information should ideally drive a focus on marine monitoring meeting overarching evidence needs in the most efficient way possible, looking kind of above individual policy questions to the need for some really key common building blocks of information at nested spatial and temporal scales. And in terms of what those building blocks of information might be, we've done some recent work, as Dickon mentioned, to kind of start exploring this. And broadly across the marine management system, there's quite a lot of commonality in the broad types of information that are required. So there's a general need for information on the location, extent, or abundance of marine habitats and species, and robust and simple metrics about their condition or health in relation to the most important impacts. There's a need for information on the location, extent, and intensity of human activities that are going on in our seas, and how those relate to pressures that are experienced by habitats and species. There's a need to understand the impacts of those pressures in the context of natural change driven by prevailing conditions, and a requirement to understand how any changes in the ecosystem translate into changes in the provision of ecosystem services and benefits that flow from those at different scales. And there's a real need to be able to integrate and analyse different data sets together to understand and predict ecosystem level change. For example, the interaction between climate-driven changes and plankton communities, and then how that affects fish populations and flows through to impacts and changes in hydrotrophic levels. So essentially, the system as a whole is interested in a kind of if you boil it right down, in where our natural assets are, how much there is, what's the condition, what's affecting those assets, how that compares to natural variability in space and time, and how any changes translate into the provision of ecosystem services and benefits, and then how different parts of the ecosystem are interacting with each other to allow us to make better predictions at a range of different scales. But despite the information needs being kind of broadly similar at a very high level, there are often different purposes that are driving the need for marine monitoring, from simply needing to understand complexity and variability, to assessing environmental status against some defined targets, through to informing and evaluating particular management interventions against their objectives. And these purposes are all equally valid and in use in operation currently across the system, depending on what particular questions and processes are being supported by the monitoring that's taking place. And it's important to recognise that one of the key purposes for marine monitoring should really be to directly inform the policy cycle, shown on the right here in green, where there's a particularly strong role for monitoring evidence in identifying the issues to be addressed and allowing any policy to be better targeted at those issues. There's no evidence-based policy without the right evidence base available at the right time in the right way. And the value of the different sectors that are currently at stake within the UK's marine policy landscape, for example, if you think of the value of offshore wind and the value of UK fisheries, that value is much greater than the current cost of marine monitoring programmes. And it's recognised, particularly in the academic literature, that an improved knowledge base allows the planning and implementation of better, more cost-effective management measures. So the value of marine monitoring in that context of supporting the policy cycle and making really the best decisions and interventions is key. To support the different purposes that are in operation across the UK policy delivery system, and to contribute to achieving government's vision for clean, healthy, safe, productive and biodiverse seas, a range of different activities and types of monitoring are taking place that are generally organised into broad themes in terms of funding streams and operational data collection. And the governance of these themes sits within the umbrella of the UK Marine Monitoring and Assessment Strategy, or UCMAS. The evidence groups within UCMAS include the Productive Seas Evidence Group, the Clean and Safe Seas Evidence Group, Healthy and Biologically Diverse Seas Evidence Group, and the Ocean Processes Evidence Group. And these groups oversee the collection, collation, and analysis of monitoring data to support big assessment processes like those done to assess good environmental status under the marine strategy. Sitting alongside these groups, but also really relevant to these types of assessments, and not only those types of big assessments, but other processes in operation, are the monitoring programs and data sets that are collected by industry sectors and academia. And where there's collaboration and communication between these different interests and different types of activities, it's extremely beneficial to the overall picture that marine monitoring can create for us. And monitoring data within the different themes is collected in a huge variety of ways, as you might imagine. The UK Marine Monitoring Portfolio employs remote and autonomous techniques, in situ observations from research vessels, citizen science programmes, and socioeconomic surveys, amongst a whole host of other methods too. And historically, data collection efforts have generally been quite segregated, with monitoring surveys for fishery stock assessments, for example, collecting fish data, and benthic marine protected areas surveys collecting seabed data, and so on. But more and more, with the increased reliability and affordability of novel methods of ecological data collection, some of which are being tested currently as part of the ECOWInd programme and other research programmes, we can now more easily collect data on multiple aspects of the ecosystem in the same space and at the same time. So more synoptic data collection that makes understanding and modelling of the relationships between different components easier to achieve. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also increasingly interested in the collection and integrated analysis of a variety of social, well-being and economic data, looking to link these with the health and functioning of our marine environment and its assets. So the UK has a well-established suite of marine monitoring programs in operation, but there are still a range of challenges that exist, which are reflected by challenges that are experienced across the globe. So the UNESCO task team for an integrated framework for sustained ocean observing have recognised similar challenges to those that we experience in the UK. And they highlight the legacy impact of having separate independent observing systems, which have evolved over time to meet specific needs, which leads to a sort of a fragmented landscape and a lack of integration across the piece. Other significant challenges exist around the need to balance the stability of longer term monitoring programs with innovation in data collection methods and within the context of a rapidly evolving policy landscape. There's a challenge around the emergence of the natural capital approach and the need to integrate different types of data from different disciplines that are collected often at different scales. The balance between implementing an evolution of monitoring approaches and a revolution in approaches, and the significant challenge of translating the monitoring data that we're collecting into the right analytical products, be that indicators, maps, or whatever it might be that's required at the right time to inform better decisions and outcomes for people and nature. Having done some recent work in this area, we think another key challenge stems from the fact that marine monitoring has often evolved to assess against particular status targets that are defined in legislation, but that the monitoring is not often as tightly linked to informing operational management measures, and therefore the value of those data sets in the context of those making those management decisions is not as easily demonstrated. And that can result in a reduction in budgets and therefore a move further and further away from being able to robustly detect meaningful change and inform and evaluate measures and interventions to achieve better outcomes for people and nature. And this is a message sort of reinforced by the recent 2024 Office for Environmental Protection annual report, which noted that despite there being a wide range of well-established biodiversity marine monitoring programs across England, their assessment of whether the environmental improvements were being made and whether those improvements were sufficient to meet our targets was limited by the available evidence base. So there's a need now to focus not only on what it's possible to measure, but crucially on what we need to understand at a system scale to put the right measures in place and evaluate then if and how those measures are improving the environment for the benefit of nature and society. It's becoming increasingly clear that there's a real sort of increased demand for robust ecological, oceanographic, social, and economic information to inform successful evidence-based policy and management decisions. There's been a recent emergence of new policy areas. There are clearly increasing ambitions for expansion of offshore wind and other renewable energies, increasing tension between achieving different policy objectives in an ever increasingly busy sea space, and increasing concerns over our ability to achieve environmental targets, such as good environmental status. Government decision-making is becoming increasingly complex, difficult, and interdisciplinary in nature. And in order to understand these complex interactions and make informed choices about the priorities and trade-offs, we need more sophisticated modelling capability to better understand cumulative effects of pressures on the system, to better understand climate change interactions, and increasingly to employ natural capital approaches to decision making. But we also need to recognise that we can't collect data on everything everywhere all at once. And we have to prioritise where we really need better monitoring information to take action, or to evaluate whether the action that's been taken is having the desired outcome. We need to be mindful that the solution to our problems might not be increased monitoring. It might be, but there's a wider sort of a wider piece around evidence, science, research, and monitoring that needs to be considered. We need to think about where it's really worth investing in improving our knowledge and what that knowledge needs to look like, bearing in mind that waiting until the extent of knowledge is complete results in the impact of decisions being greatly reduced. This slide that you can see here shows the consequences model, which was something that was discussed a little bit at this year's Ocean and Coastal Futures conference. It's not something that I'd seen before, but I think it's a really useful concept to keep in mind when we're thinking about where we need to focus future efforts in a marine monitoring context. So in thinking about how to balance the priorities and the investment in knowledge in the long-term context of marine monitoring specifically, I think it's useful to consider the approach proposed in the 2019 paper, which is Future Ocean Observations to Connect Climate, Fisheries and Marine Ecosystems, where the authors suggest an approach to monitoring which is built really heavily around improving and validating predictive modelling capability, ensuring data quality, establishing strong governance and collaboration, and focusing on delivering a monitoring approach that's fit for purpose and is stable, rather than being perfectly aligned to the current conditions and policy landscape. So we've used this as a basis to suggest some principles for the future of UK marine monitoring that we think could usefully guide the evolution of the approach. And you can see those 5 Ps of marine monitoring there at the bottom of the slide. So we have purpose-driven, predictive, prioritised, progressive, and participatory. In terms of specific steps to make progress in this context, it would be valuable to start by revisiting the range of legal obligations, processes, decision-making, and policies which have evolved over time to shape the current marine monitoring approach. And perhaps take a step back to redefine and agree an updated system-wide set of purposes and suite of priority questions that marine monitoring needs to help us answer. This would also help us to define what we need monitoring to deliver specifically in relation to what wider science, evidence, and research should deliver. If we have a good handle on the priority monitoring questions, we could then identify some common building blocks of information that are needed across the system. And that would allow us to design a theoretical monitoring programme that would be able to deliver against those information needs. We could then compare the existing design and approach to that theoretical ideal and identify a phased pathway for transitioning from the current situation to our ideal, probably with some bottom-up and top-down changes in the short, medium and long term. And as we move along that transition pathway, it should allow us to demonstrate incremental value across multiple policy areas and decisions, which would allow us to make a really strong case for further investment in the transition along the pathway. And a really crucial part of this would be to periodically review where we're at with our marine monitoring and adapt and flex the approach if needed, bearing in mind that fine balance that needs to be struck between something that is stable with something that is innovative and responding to the policy questions at that particular time. But an adaptive cycle of monitoring that's periodically reviewed and ensured that it's fit for purpose is really key here. So as an illustration of how the demand for robust monitoring data to understand ecosystem interactions is changing, we can look at the approach to understanding climate interactions across the system, both in terms of how climate change affects different ecological receptors and interacts with other pressures, but also how different policy choices and scenarios affect our ability to meet our climate targets and reduce impacts. The most recently updated version of the UK Marine Strategy Part 2 on monitoring programmes recognises that although no monitoring programme was originally specifically put in place to monitor changes in prevailing hydrographical conditions, this information is becoming more important to integrate into our GES indicator assessments, and that issue, that evidence gap, needs to be addressed. And a specific, more local example of where this issue has really come to the fore is following the whelk population mortality event in the Thames estuary in 2022. So the Kent and Essex IFCA responded to this event by putting in place a monitoring programme to try to better understand the causes, which are now thought to be climate change related. The monitoring capability aims to allow the community to be able to predict and prepare for those types of events more proactively in the future, and to support better climate adaptive fisheries management practices as a result of having access to that data and that knowledge. As another example of the value of purpose-driven monitoring, funding from DEFRA's Marine Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme is expanding the capability of some of the UK's marine monitoring programmes to better understand the wider benefits of certain habitats, including coastal salt marsh. And historically, 85% of the extent of the UK salt marsh habitat has been lost, causing issues for biodiversity, for climate, society, and the economy. This habitat has important roles to play in delivering a range of ecosystem services, and a lack of data on how the habitat functions is hindering targeted action on restoration and to prevent further loss. Monitoring of the greenhouse gases captured and stored by salt marshes using a new network of flux towers will help us to understand the role of salt marsh in climate change mitigation. Ideally, this will then support the inclusion of salt marsh in the UK's greenhouse gas inventory, driving investment in protection and restoration projects to deliver multiple benefits for climate, coastal flood defences, and biodiversity enhancement. So the range of monitoring related initiatives, both across the UK and more widely than that, is very vast. Just picking up a few examples from this slide here, the Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Programme, or ORJIP, is currently running a project looking at ensuring that post-consent monitoring data on impacts from offshore wind farms is fed back into cumulative effects assessments during future consenting processes. This is a loop of information which is currently not functioning effectively, and that's preventing us from harnessing the value of investment in post-consent monitoring across industry. The Marine Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme is looking quite broadly at how England's marine and fisheries monitoring needs to evolve to enable a natural capital approach to policy and decision making. And the ScotMare programme is exploring what a strategic, sustained observation programme for future offshore wind might look like. So there's a huge amount of momentum, ambition, and fantastic work going on across the board to achieve more coordinated, more efficient, and meaningful monitoring for sustainable management of our marine environment. Further join up across these initiatives set within the context of a clearly articulated and strongly led purpose and set of priority questions for marine monitoring would drive real change in this space and demonstrate the importance of marine monitoring as the backbone of sustainable management of UK seas. So just finally, I thought it'd be worth touching on some of the key areas we think the research community can help within the context of the current and future marine monitoring approaches and ambitions. It's really valuable for the research community to understand the impact pathways for monitoring data and evidence products to support UK policy delivery and influence decision making. Research can help us determine what data gaps really matter, what socio-ecological components we need to monitor to be able to make better decisions, and when do we know enough. Research can help us determine what change is important in relation to a suitable baseline, and what thresholds do monitoring programs need to be able to discriminate between. It can help us explore how to practically undertake more integrated monitoring across different scales, different themes, and different disciplines, and explore how we can integrate understanding of ecological status with socioeconomic outcomes and link these different data sets together with sophisticated analytical approaches. It can help us understand what innovative technology can do for us and what it can't in relation to the most important questions that monitoring needs to be able to answer. And related to that, can help us determine where we need common standards for monitoring and where we don't. So those are just some key highlights there for how the research community can help feed into this, this really exciting area. That's all from me. Thanks ever so much for listening, and I'll pass back to Dickon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hayley. That was super interesting. We've got a panel discussion now, so if I could ask the panelists to turn their cameras on, that'd be great. Hi, Hank. So we do have some questions prepared, and I would encourage anyone to put questions in the chat as well. For some reason, my Q&A isn't loading right now. It was Hank that has put a comment in there saying, put any questions you have in there, which is great. Thank you, Hank. So we'll start with a question for the panel, which is quite a broad question. It feels like we've been talking about delivering better monitoring for our UK marine environment, certainly since I started working in government in 2009. And that's 15 years ago now, and I know that the conversations were being had before then. So I'd just be interested to get your experience as people who've worked in that space before and have put a lot of time and effort over the course of your careers into it. What do you see as the biggest challenge in delivering an integrated, meaningful monitoring capability in the UK? And Hayley's done a lot of talking, so I'm going to go to Hank first, if that's okay.
Yes, of course, that's fine. It's tricky to pinpoint that down to just one challenge, Dickon.
Biggest challenges then, if you want, Hank. Feel free to expand on that.
Well, one of the things that we've seen over the years is sometimes what you could perceive as a mismatch between the monitoring needs, which I think Hayley's expressed as a key part of the process, but also how the monitoring community, and this is mostly made up of scientists, people who have backgrounds in the collection of field data, in instruments and technology, and it's really bringing those two communities closer together so that the actual scientific study of detecting meaningful change in our environment is better connected and aligned with the actual needs, the the policy needs and our societal needs to understand what it is that we're trying to understand, and that sounds like a really simple thing, but actually that fundamental connection between those two quite broad areas, they're often quite different in practice. So I think if one were to look at how you can better integrate the entire monitoring system, one place that you could look at is trying to better connect monitoring needs and policy needs with the actual science itself.
Okay, great. Thank you, Hank. Paul, have you got any reflections on that?
Yeah, thanks, Dick, and great presentation, Hayley. Thank you. I think the point that Hank raised is a critical one. So the translating the policy needs and legislative and needs down through the system, so the monitoring requirements are clear. But I think to add to that, I think for me, having worked in monitoring for longer than I'd care to say, it always seemed easier to bolt something on than rather look at the whole system as it stands. And I think a key challenge moving forward is to be brave and do that, and almost take a step back and look at all the monitoring that's ongoing and have a think about the scale at which we kind of, I guess, attack monitoring. It's very site specific, it's very question orientated, and I think a challenge for us is to think more maybe at a sea level or at a regional level, and think about how we could monitor those larger areas more effectively. And I think some key outcomes from that would be sort of the development of standardized approaches to monitoring that could be picked up through government, could be picked up through industry, could be picked up through academia, which means that all data collected would be in a standardized format, which could be used for a multitude of reasons, from natural variability to impact studies to looking at good environmental status and management effectiveness.
Thanks, Paul. Hayley, if you got any reflections?
Yeah, thanks, Dickon. Yeah, I've got loads of reflections, loads of things spinning around in my head. Yeah, I agree with everything that Henk and Paul have said so far. There are lots of challenges. There are lots of interconnected challenges, and I think just untangling the challenges and finding a starting point at which to start kind of working things through is not an insignificant challenge in itself. I think the thing that always comes to my mind firstly is the challenge that was recognized and sort of raised in this UNESCO task team report, as well as through the work that we've done, which is that kind of organic evolution of monitoring that's resulted in a lot of fragmented, separate monitoring programs and data collection approaches, and that's quite different to something that is overarching and serving multiple needs across the system in a kind of more policy agnostic way, something that is stable and providing that long-term contextual background. And that's the place that we've gotten to is then quite difficult to row back from. And I think this is essentially similar to what Paul was saying about needing to be brave and try to zoom back out and think about the system as a whole. And that's quite a complex and sensitive thing to do, which will require a long-term transition that we'll need to invest in, and that will require some really dedicated leadership and a clear kind of vision and purpose for monitoring that everybody can kind of get behind and coalesce around. So I think there's a massive opportunity at the moment to try and think about things in a different way in relation to marine monitoring, but it will be a significant, quite a significant challenge to get everybody sort of focused and pointing in the same direction.
So just picking up on a couple of things you said there, Hayley, when we think about, so we do a lot of work in the developing world as well as in the UK, and I often hear the same refrain, regardless of whether I'm in Grenada or Kenya or the UK. We don't have enough data. We've got big gaps. We just can't do. We don't know what's going on. And that can't be the same for those countries that are really, really financially constrained as it is for us. But put alongside that, I also hear quite a lot from friends of mine who work in the academic community that it's hard to get funding for long-term research. So research that goes, by long-term we mean like 10-year, 20-year programs, because funding's geared towards innovation and pushing the boundaries of science and what we know. So the funding that we do get, like in ECOWInd, is for a 3-year program that's going out and doing some stuff, creating some new knowledge, developing new methods, and then stepping away. So there's sort of a long-winded way of saying that there's a topic of discussion, I think, rather than a question, around how much do we need to know to be able to take action, and also tied into that, how do we make sure that the innovation that's coming out of, say, NERC funded science is feeding well into the long-term government marine monitoring programs, because it feels like they operate in quite different spaces sometimes. I don't know if anyone wants to have a crack at that first.
I'm happy to
Go on, Paul.
throw
Sorry.
my hat in the ring. That's right. I think it comes back to one of the key comments that Henk mentioned, and it's identify. It starts right at the very top. So it's identifying what the policy and legislative drivers are. You know, what information do we need? And I think at that point there then needs to be a level of coordination that commissions the research or the work that's required, because at the moment if you think of the structure that we have lots of different science teams and policy teams that commission their work individually, which means it's not coordinated. So it needs that bigger picture approach right from the very top, so the commissioning of the work is done in a way that feeds directly into the policy and legislative drivers. And I think if it was done in that way, it would be a lot more efficient, which would then free up a lot more resource, be that sort of human resource or actually monetary resources, to actually start to commission the longer term research programs that are going to need to take this bigger picture look. And I think it also needs to bring everybody together. So it needs to be done in a coordinated way in terms of not just maybe government funded bodies, but looking more to the research communities, looking more to industry, all the key players that are involved in collecting information from marine habitats and the marine space.
And standardization has a big role in that, doesn't it, Paul, to make sure that people are collecting things in the same way and almost analysing things in the same way as well, if possible.
Yeah, it'd be almost a natural knock-on process, that if everybody was working in some long-term programs, then it would give everybody the ability to look at how that data was collected, standardizing it, even, or not necessarily saying you have to collect it in this way, but thinking about how that data would be brought together at a later stage. And I think, and then the other point to that is then the data accessibility and where the data is stored. So I think the coordination, if it starts from the top, would hopefully then run all the way through the process.
Great, thanks, Paul. Hank, go on. I see you're itching to.
Well, it's. I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and I completely agree with Paul. Building on that needs to be at the bottom of the foundation of how you build a monitoring program, and fundamentally, it often comes down to questions. What questions are we trying to answer? What are we asking? And if we move to the academic community, which I think you mentioned, Dickon, I was thinking about how can the academic community help? Well, we have a lot of information. There's an enormous amount of information, and sometimes it's not the most accessible. So it could be privately held on hard drives. It could be shared in public databases. But however it is, and there are challenges around the accessibility of data that Paul raised, however it is made available, as you said, Dickon, that we've got an enormous amount of information. And to be honest, being someone who has looked at some of that information over the years in a past life, we don't fully understand what it is that is represented in our data. We're good at describing things, but understanding the true significance of whether you have 20 of this or 3 of that, or whether that matters, we don't know. And we often in the past haven't invested enough in understanding what our information is trying to tell us, or the information not trying to tell us anything, but trying to understand what is in that information and what is of relevance to the questions that Paul is asking. But what we're good at is setting up a new monitoring program. And that's maybe not what's needed. Maybe we need to look at what we've got, ask better questions and look at what we've got and try to better understand that. I think that's where the academic community can really help us.
Yeah, so that sort of data mining to find new insights, and great. Thank you, Hank. Hayley.
Yeah, thanks, Dickon. I think focusing on the bit of the question that was about how do we bring what the research community are exploring more closely into the government sort of marine monitoring space. I think there's a massive opportunity there to get more players involved in the UK marine monitoring kind of landscape. It will involve, as we've kind of just been talking around, a really clear articulation of what are the key questions that we are trying to answer, specifically with monitoring. There are lots and lots and lots of questions that need answering, and we need to tease out, I think, which of those need to be answered by long-term monitoring and which of those are something else. And if we can really pin that down and as a community articulate that and spend some time, some fully resourced, fully planned time on both sides talking about what those questions should be and how best to answer them, both in terms of the design of a program, the data collection methods, the analytical approaches, the timing that things need to be available to support different kind of government policy decisions or operational kind of management processes, we can get a lot closer together. So we can bring the two sides a lot closer together, because there's huge capability in in lots of different areas that could deliver really, really meaningful, innovative, cost-effective synoptic data. And it's just trying to understand the barriers to that. Are we talking about cost barriers? Are we talking about training barriers? Are we talking about the fact that bringing something in would really disrupt a time series, so we need to spend some time understanding and calibrating different methods? So just, I think, making that part of the marine monitoring space kind of fully resourced part of our capability would be really helpful to unlock some of that and bring it into the government monitoring portfolio.
So just
that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. Just to tease that apart a little bit, when we're thinking about the questions that we're answering with monitoring, and you touched on this in your presentation, we are thinking about longer term trends in things like good environmental status, climate change, but those trends in and of themselves are useful to know where we are, so they're good as success indicators of to some degree, and to help us inform future decision making. But when we talk about scale, and you've got those long-term trends over larger biogeographic areas, they're essential so that you can contextualize project level decision making, whether that's for MPA management or for an offshore wind farm or for a marine license or for fishing, for example. And so there's something about understanding both that link between the strategic purpose of monitoring in terms of long-term trends and the actual project level decision making, but also making sure that when we're doing the research, which is based around innovation and pushing boundaries, that we're thinking about, and this is something that I know we not struggle with, but we tussle with a lot in the ECOWInd program, but also Insight, I think, is how do we take that research out of the lab and put it into something that's repeatable over a long period of time. And that's always something that we need to make sure we've got an eye on at the beginning when things are being designed, I think. So the other question that we're going to talk about, and I'm happy to take reflections on what I've just said as well, is just thinking about when we're working at those different scales, it's always worth talking about industry data. Whenever we talk about monitoring, we talk about all the work that's going on out there about EIA and why it isn't used better. And we know that there are issues about scale and methodology and data accessibility and lots of other sort of things. And I just wondered whether we might have, in our last sort of 5 minutes or so, have a bit of a chat around that. And everyone else has been first, but Hayley, you haven't, so I don't know if you want to go first this time. I'm quite happy to take one of the others.
No, I can do. Certainly, I think there's the potential for a huge amount of value to be extracted from those smaller scale monitoring data sets that are being collected by industry, and larger scale data sets that are being collected by industry. And I think we just need to invest some real time, energy and people into understanding what those data look like and what we can do with them in a real sort of test case scenario. So maybe taking some of those indicators that we try to look at a broad scale under the marine strategy and really practically trying to get some industry data out of, for example, the Marine Data Exchange, and use them and work through if that's possible or not, and if not, why not? Is it because of methodology? Is it because the parameters aren't quite right? Is it, what exactly is it metadata standards? Is it formatting? Is it something else? And just trying to get to the bottom of that, and then feeding that back into, are there opportunities in the regulatory context to change how some of these data are collected or stored, archived? Is it because we just can't find them? Is it because it's too inaccessible? So just getting to the bottom of some of that, I think, would be really helpful. And I know people are thinking about that in some of the UCMAS evidence groups and have been for some time. And I think that would be really, really valuable. And I thought it was really interesting that some of the monitoring initiatives that are going on within the industry space, like some of the ORGIP projects, there's a project that they're getting off the ground called Closing the Loop, which is looking at how can the post-consent monitoring that industry are doing around offshore wind farms, for example, how can we make that feed back into the top so that when people are doing their EIAs, their cumulative effects assessment for EIAs or whatever it might be, they're using those data. So some of these loops that you might assume are quite small and should be functioning really effectively because that would have a massive benefit. It's harnessing an investment that people have put into collecting a lot of really useful fine scale resolution data on impacts. Those loops aren't functioning as well as they should be. So it's just trying to figure out where those breakdowns are happening, I think, and just putting in some really targeted investment in trying to sort them out, because it won't happen organically if we're not actually making a concerted effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And Henk, I know you've been thinking a lot about this, both in Insight and ECOWInd. You're on mute, Henk.
Oh, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, sure I have. And Haley raises a really great point. And I see you've just popped the link in the chat there, so people can find out more about that project. I'll add a different point around how we can work better with industry, and I'll also leave a minute or two for Paul to come in on this. I think one of the things, and I think Paul raised this, around standards. So if industry were required or collected data according to a set standard that could fit within a wider data framework, then those samples, if they weren't commercially sensitive, those samples and that information could be readily used by government. So I've just popped in a link there to a project Haley and I worked on in JNCC, which was influenced by representatives from industry. And it's essentially, these are data standards for imagery, underwater imagery data. And there are three standards there, sort of low, medium, and high as such in terms of their complexity. But if you could at least comply to the low standard, those data that you're collecting could be immediately useful to a wider government community. So it's initiatives like that, I think, can help industry get on board and make their data more available for others.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Henk. And Paul, last word to you in the last minute. Sorry.
Oh, cheers, Dickon. I was just going to give an example of a piece of work that we've just initiated now, which kind of feeds really nicely into this discussion, and trying to think about how you use standardized data to assess impacts in an operational and repeatable way. So at the moment, site-specific impact data such as noise is collected in very specific ways. There's very specific models to calculate what that footprint may be. But almost taking a step back and thinking, how actually could we collect that data and develop models that could be used in a more standardized approach, so assessments of impacts are repeatable? And I'm thinking about if people are trying to assess the impacts on maybe protected areas, and how you could set that process up and apply it to one site, but then just lift it and maybe with some small tweaks then assess another site. So we can start looking on a larger scale of how these impacts are being, or if there are any impacts, but actually assessing those impacts. And I think having access to that industry data, that if I use noise as an example, so what is an noise of an operating wind farm? There's a lot of data behind that, but that data could probably be used to generate those kind of values that then could be used more widely in a more standardized approach.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. And that brings us very neatly to 1 o'clock. So well done on the timing of your answer then. It's just left for me to say thank you to all of you for attending, and thank you to the panel for talking. Our next Policy Masterclass will be on 5 Capitals Approach to Marine Management, which will be on the 9th of July. We hope to see you there. Brilliant. Thank you all for coming, and yes, hopefully see you at the next one. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.